Around 15 years ago, our First Minister, the late Alex Salmond, said that Scotland had the potential to be the Saudi Arabia of renewables. He repeated this a few times over the decade that followed. Would you agree? And if there was potential, has it been realised?
Well, I think that, it's been partly realised, right? I mean, the renewables industry in the UK is concentrated in and around Scotland, particularly wind power. But here's the thing, right, that Salmond got completely wrong, and which the world in general has kind of woken up to in the last couple of years, and this is what my book is essentially about, is that the renewables business is not a wonderful business. Profits in that business are typically quite low. They're typically quite volatile, and so the idea that this is an industry where there are kind of great riches to be found has been proven, is sadly in a way comprehensively untrue.
Is the renewable sector historically good for employment? And if Scotland has more renewable electricity, does this mean a lot more good paid jobs?
That, I think, that question is a wee bit the elephant in the room when it comes to the renewables question. I will preface what I'm going to say here by saying that I'm no expert on this, but I do know that once you have a wind farm, for example, built and up and running, you typically don't see many people working there. Occasionally a rotor will stop turning, and the owner or the manager of that facility has to send out an engineer with a screwdriver to kind of fix it and get them. But basically, once a renewables facility is built, for the next 25 to 30 years, it doesn't really need anyone working there. It's incredibly labor unintensive. Now, of course, lots and lots of people are required to build the wind or solar farm, which might take 6 to 12 months, a bit more if it's an offshore wind farm. Lots of people are required to design and build the technologies used in those facilities. Well, of course, globally that occurs mainly in China and Southeast Asia right now. But the idea that the renewable sector as a whole is a kind of goldmine for employment is, I think, a very, very problematic one.
Gillian Martin, our acting Cabinet Secretary for Net Zero and Energy, was asked a question about zonal pricing in the Chamber last week, and this was her answer. She said, modelling indicates that Scotland's consumers could potentially benefit from lower wholesale electricity prices. However, we're also aware of modelling which suggests potentially negative impacts for Scotland's renewable industry. Now, to me, this highlights the problem at the heart of renewable generation, and I think it's central to your book, that what's good for the company is often bad for the consumer and vice versa. Is this really an argument that says that electricity generation should be brought back under state control?
For me, it is. I mean, I think the UK is the kind of standout case, again, not just in electricity, but in water too, for public ownership of these assets. I think in almost every conceivable regard, privatisation has been a bit of a disaster. But I think that comment you made about specifically about Scotland and that quote, I mean, I think that's right. And I can, let me refer to Sweden, where I live, as an example of this. So Sweden has zonal electricity pricing, which obviously the UK doesn't have at the moment, but the UK is thinking about having, which essentially means that the price of electricity, particularly in wholesale markets, is allowed to vary across the country in different zones. And so what you have in Sweden in recent years is that in the north of the country, which is where most of the renewable and most of the wind and hydro capacity is concentrated, but not many people live, you have much lower electricity prices in general, which speaks to that person's comment about low prices. But the quid pro quo, of course, is that if you have those lower prices and higher prices in the south of the country, in theory at least, that would incentivize new developers to establish their facilities closer to where the higher prices are. And that's the idea behind the policy, right? Is that the reason they want to do that is that having most of the generating capacity in one part of the country, in Scotland, in the UK's case, and having most of the demand for that electricity somewhere else in the southeast and in England in general, it imposes a massive burden the electricity grid, right? It imposes a massive burden on the fact that historically, most electricity conventional power plants were located relatively close to centres of demand. That geography is very, very different with renewables, and regulators and governments the world over have been grappling with that quandary for many, many years now. And the zonal system is it answers some questions, but then it creates other questions entirely. There's no perfect model.
Yeah.
That works, from the perspective of both the consumers and the industries.
There are no direct electricity pipelines from Scotland to any other country in Europe. We do have a small one that goes to Northern Ireland. Is this a peculiar situation, considering that Scotland continues to generate more electricity than it needs?
I wouldn't say it's peculiar. I mean, I think it's a reflection of history and of the fact that historically, most electricity that was generated within a particular country was consumed within a particular country. Of course, that's changed in recent decades in continental Europe with the growth of interconnectors between the different continental electricity markets, and those markets themselves have been effectively unified into a pan-European electricity market. But the UK is an island. And there are ongoing initiatives to try to rectify that. But I wouldn't say it's surprising. I think it's very much a path dependent.
There are pipelines. I think there's several pipelines, and they all leave from England to going to the continent. I think that historically the reason for that is that the UK has typically been a net importer rather than net exporter of electricity. And so if you think about it from the UK's perspective, it's been concerned about bringing stuff in rather than sending stuff out. And therefore, it hasn't been so concerned about sending stuff from Scotland elsewhere in Europe. Have we seen peak renewables in Scotland? In 2013, generation capacity was 17 terawatt hours. In only 7 years, it doubled. But in the last 3 years, it's hardly moved, adding only 1 terawatt hour. What is happening?
Well, I think, there's lots of reasons for that. I wouldn't say I would be amazed if we've seen peak capacity, simply because I think that if Labour is going to have any shot of hitting its clean energy targets for 2030, which are very, very ambitious, then there's going to need to be a huge amount of new renewables capacity in the UK. And I think it's inevitable that a substantive proportion of that will have to be in Scotland. But I think the reality is that relative to the market and the technology's ability to absorb that massive growth that occurred historically, there was an overgrowth of renewables capacity in Scotland, such that a lot of that energy production actually gets curtailed at different points in time. It gets wasted because the technology wasn't able to distribute it as effectively as was needed across the country because of the limited interconnection capacity. So it definitely hasn't reached its peak, I would imagine. But as I say, relative to kind of the technological and industry constraints that exist, there was overgrowth in the past.